everybody. Welcome to the webinar with Kivi Leroux Miller of nonprofitmarketingguide.com. Again, I'm Lindsay Nichols. I'm the Communications Director here at GuideStar. I personally took Kivi's 2014 Nonprofit Communications Trend Survey, and I hope many of you did too. And today we're going to get to preliminary findings from that survey to learn the things that are going to keep us up next year and what opportunities we're going to be facing. And all of you will receive the full trends report when it's released in January. So let's go ahead and get started. Before I introduce Kivi, I need to take care of just two housekeeping items. First, we're live tweeting during today's presentation using the hashtag NPOCommsTrends. That's NPOCOMMS Trends. So please join our conversation there. And secondly, we are happy to take questions from you during the presentation. You can submit it via Twitter or WebEx. And if we can't get to all of our answers or to all of your questions, Kivi said she will answer some additional questions on our GuideStar blog next year. So watch out for that. And finally, we will send all of you an email with Kivi's PowerPoint and recording of this presentation in a few days. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce Kivi Leroux Miller, President of nonprofitmarketingguide.com, where she writes the top-ranked blog on nonprofit communications and teaches a weekly webinar series on nonprofit marketing. She's the author of two books. The first is The Nonprofit Marketing Guide, and her latest, which I was lucky enough to review, and I can tell you it's a must-read for nonprofit communicators, it's titled Content Marketing for Nonprofits, a communications map for engaging your community, becoming a favorite cause, and raising more money. And that's available on Kivi's site and on Amazon. I know she's going to give us a ton of great communications insights. So Kivi, take it away.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. The first question is, why are you doing all these surveys about trends? And I'm doing it to answer this question, which I get all the time, which is, am I normal? Is what my nonprofit is doing or what I want to do or what our board is asking us to do, is it normal? Is it what other nonprofits are doing? And I didn't have a lot of good data to answer that question well. So about 4 years ago, we decided to get it. So this is the 4th edition of the annual Nonprofit Communications Trends Report. As I go through some of the preliminary results, and these are very preliminary, I'm going to spend the next several weeks really diving into the data and creating the full report. I want you to think about what's the biggest surprise or even just the thing you found most interesting during the presentation today. We'll ask for that at the end, and I may end up including some of those things in the final report. As we go through, I'm also going to do 4 polls to have you guess what the results might say, and then we'll reveal those to you just to make it a little more fun today. And I've also identified some places where there may be some conflict within your organization based on the results that you see. So it's not really trying to say who's right or who's wrong about something, but rather just identifying that this might be a source of tension so that you can take that data and open up those conversations within your organization. So I've highlighted a few of those as we go along too. I want to say right at the top, these slides look terrible. Some of the charts are really hard to read. They will look beautiful and very user-friendly in the final report. But for today, since we just closed the report or the survey, these are basically the SurveyMonkey generic slides on some of the charts. So we'll pretty them up for you, and just bear with me today. So basically, where is this coming from? Who are these people that are pulling all of this information together for you? As I said, it's an online survey. We did it the whole month of November. We had the most participation ever this year. It was fully completed by over 2,000 nonprofits. 88% of those are from the U.S., 6% from Canada, the rest from other parts of the world. We had almost an exact equal split between what I would consider the small versus large organizations. So those are organizations we use $1 million as the cutoff. And we had a really diverse representation of missions. So we have, I think, about a dozen different mission categories. It's the same ones that the Foundation Center uses. And you can see the biggest cohort, 23% was human services, housing, food, jobs, 16% education, 10% health, disease, medical, and then everybody else was 10 or less. We asked 2 new questions this year as sort of demographic questions to pull the data in a couple of different ways. I was curious about these questions because I do a lot of training and coaching and mentoring with communications directors. And so I see where the sources of tension are within organizations. And I've sort of figured out over time that your job within the organization may affect the way that you approach problem solving or just the way that you see the world. So I thought job title would be an interesting way to look at some of this information. So we asked that this year. And as you can see, we have a pretty good diversity of people filling out the survey. 60% were what I would consider managers, so either executive directors or had director or manager in the title. Others were assistants or coordinator level. When you look at who's communications versus development or fundraising, which can also be sometimes a source of tension, about 40% of the staff and management, excluding executive directors, identified themselves as being communications and marketing, and 20% identified themselves as being development or fundraising. I also asked about age this year, and this can be sort of a sensitive topic, so of course we let people decline to state if they wanted to. I was very pleased to see that we had really good representation across generations, and I asked this question for two reasons. One, because of the workplace tension issues. There's lots of reporting out there about how different generations work with each other and behave around each other in the office, so that was one element. The second was that we have pretty good data on how people consume information differently based on their age. So, even in our own sector, Blackbaud has released a report on the next generation of American giving. Pew Internet does research on whether people like to get information online or not. So we have good information about how people consume information. I was curious to see if age affected the producers of that content, all of us communicating about our nonprofits. So that's really the motivation for asking this question. Let's get to the results, shall we? So I've broken it down into a couple of big categories here. First, we'll look at goals. Again, I've noticed some conflict within nonprofits about whether you're communicating for fundraising versus brand raising versus meeting programmatic goals. So I asked a very big question: which is most important to your personal success? The marketing, the fundraising, the programmatic goals, or a combination of all three? And so again, you can see how it's broken out. The big orange slice is a combination of all three. The blue slice is marketing goals, purple slice is fundraising goals, and then the orangish, darkish orangish red is programmatic goals. So people are coming at this work, their nonprofit communications work, with different goals in mind, and that's an important thing to understand and acknowledge within your own organization. Looking more specifically at those goals, we asked people to pick the three most important goals for their strategy for 2014. And again, you can see the diversity here. The bottom slice on the orange slice on the bottom, 53%, acquiring new donors. The next one, engaging our community, followed by general brand awareness. Those are the top three, and those were the top three last year as well. These numbers haven't really changed that much since last year. So, conflict point. Maybe, maybe not, but it's something to be aware of within your organization. When we look at who said what was most important, people who identify themselves as communications or marketing staff or managers believe that engaging the community is the most important goal. Executive directors and development and fundraising staff or managers believe that acquiring new donors is the most important goal. And it's not that those things are mutually exclusive, but you can make very different decisions about where you're going to focus your communication strategy and what communications tools you're going to use based on which goal is most important to you. So again, I'm not telling you what's right for your organization. I'm trying to point out a potential source of conflict so that if you're feeling like things aren't quite going right in your organization, you can ask good questions. Now, we hear a lot about donor retention. That's sort of the big buzzword topic du jour. Practically every fundraising consultant on the planet is talking about donor retention on their blogs right now. So I went ahead and took a quick look at who thinks donor retention is particularly important, who put that in their top three goals. And I found this really interesting. Development directors, not surprisingly, 64% included donor retention in their top three. For executive directors, it was only 34%, and for communications directors, it was only 16%. So if donor retention is a big project for you, you may need to do some communications work internally to get everybody to agree with you about that. All right, let's look at tools. And again, I apologize for the chart. These will be much better in the print report. We asked people which communications channels were very important, somewhat important, and least important to them or would be in 2014. And so the dark green are the people who answered it was very important. The lighter green is somewhat important, and the orange is least important. So you can see from the left to the right the ranking of the channels overall. So website, email marketing, social media, other than blogging, in-person events, media relations, PR, those would be the top 5 communications channels that nonprofits are saying are most important to their success. This has not changed with one little exception for the last 3 years. Let's look at this a different way. What I've done is I've stacked the somewhat important and the very important together to give you a little bit of a better sense. This is the chart from last year. Okay, so keep an eye on the left-hand side of the chart as I pop up the slide for 2014. What you may have seen there is that email bumped back up instead of social media for the second place. And we've seen that kind of happen over the last couple of years. Social media, other than blogging and email marketing, sort of vying for second place in the chart. The other thing you want to note is video continues to grow. If you look at the things that are more to the right of the chart, video is the one communications channel that has steadily increased year over year, whereas some of these others have remained fairly flat or have had very minimal growth over time. All right, we're up to one of those pop quizzes. So, do the very important communications tools vary by age of survey participant? What would be your gut reaction to that question? Yes, I would expect it to vary significantly. No, I don't think it would vary much, or I'm not sure. You should have a poll coming up on your screen now, and just go ahead and click on the little bullet to vote in the poll. Lindsay, are there any questions I can answer really quickly?
Yes, while we're waiting for that, somebody had a question, are annual reports a thing of the past?
Well, we do ask about annual reports. I'm not sure that it made it into this deck. They are not a thing of the past, but I can tell you they are not the favorite communications tool of the nonprofit sector either. I do a whole other series and spiel on annual reports and why everybody hates them and what they need to do to transform them into documents they like producing and that their folks will like to read. So we've got more information on that we can send people.
Excellent.
I think the poll is closed, and so we're just waiting for the results, which take a few minutes, or a few seconds rather, to be compiled. Okay, so we have 73% say yes, I would expect to see differences. 24% say no, and 3% not sure. All right, let me tell you what we found. We found that there really aren't significant differences except for 2 small exceptions. In terms of picking the top 2, website and email, that was consistent across age groups. Where we saw a little bit of variation was in what people put in 3rd and 4th place. So 20s, 30s, and 40-somethings put social media in 3rd place and events in 4th place. 50 and 60-plus-year-olds did the inverse. So they put in-person events in 3rd place and social media in 4th place. So again, I don't think this is a terribly significant finding. Everybody still has the same top 4, but it may be worth a conversation within your organization, depending on the kind of other conversations you're having about social media and events. In terms of other communications channels, the one that had the biggest separation between the younger and older was press releases. And again, you can see that separation is only 8 percentage points. So it's significant, but it's not it's not like a 30-point difference. So I would say the differences are pretty small in this case and may not even be relevant within your organization. It just sort of depends on what else you're doing. Okay, we also asked people which one type of content they believed was most effective in their organization? And this is a brand new question. We at Nonprofit Marketing Guide did a little bit of crowdsourcing on some new questions this year, and so this was one that was submitted and voted on, so we added it to the poll this year. Presentations delivered in person, most effective, which is interesting, of course, because in some of the other places it doesn't rank that highly. Email newsletter articles, print fundraising appeals, then Facebook, then event marketing. Now, let's look at who said what. Okay, again, potential source for conflict within your organization, maybe, maybe not. But if you're finding that there are arguments about this stuff, this data might be helpful in helping you facilitate that conversation. So executive directors picked as most effective presentations. The communications staff, both the coordinator level and the director level together, both of them, picked email newsletter articles as the single most effective. And fundraisers, both, again, the coordinator and director level, picked fundraising appeals, print fundraising appeals. So again, just little interesting differences to keep in mind. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about social media. No wild shocker here. This hasn't really changed much for the last several years. Facebook is still the king of social media, followed by Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and then the sort of also-rans. Not much of a change there. I pulled this by job title to see if this mattered. You know, do fundraisers think one social media is better than executive directors do? And we found that there was not really any significant variation by job title. So this is a place where we do have agreement across the organization. So again, you can see how it's broken out, and really there's just not that much variation when you look at the numbers. One big change from last year, we ask people not only what you're going to use and what's going to be important to you in 2014, but if you're going to add something or experiment with something, what would that be? And Instagram jumped from 5th place last year to 1st place this year. So Instagram is the big winner on the nonprofit social media playground. Of course, Pinterest is still 2nd. It was 1st last year. Pop quiz time again. Would you expect the social media site people want to add or experiment with, that last slide I just showed you, to vary by age? So again, we have that poll up for you that you have the same choices. Yes, I think it's going to vary significantly. No, I don't think it's going to vary very much. Or I'm not sure. Do we have another question we might be able to do, Lindsay?
We do. One asked a very specific question. How do you define in-person events?
You know, we didn't really give people a definition, so it's up to them to decide what it was. It was, you know, basically human beings in the same place as opposed to doing it online or in print, but we didn't say anything about, you know, number of attendees or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. And since we're still waiting just another minute, here's a question that you may be addressing later, but one wants to know, is it better to have one social media account, you know, Facebook or Twitter account, to house all programs, or to give each program his or her, you know, its own account?
I think it depends on what you feel like you have to say in that account, and then how specialized the community might be around it. So, for example, if you're an organization that does research behind the scenes but also has some sort of like more public-facing programming, you may want to do a separate Twitter feed for the scientific community that's, you know, much more wonky and jargon-filled than what your main Twitter feed will likely be, which is that more sort of public-facing consumer kind of language and information. So it really just depends on your programming and whether you have enough different content and then enough of a different audience or community to consume that content.
Thank you.
All right, we have our poll results. So what do we have here? On this one, 69% expect it to be different, 27% don't expect to change, and again, 3% not sure. This one, we did see a bit of a change. Again, remember, this is experimenting. This is not core channels. Everybody agreed on core channels. But what you're going to add did vary by age. 20 to 30-somethings selected Instagram. 40 to 50-somethings were more likely to select Pinterest, and 60 and over were more likely to add YouTube. I pulled some data from Pew, who has looked at who's doing what with social networking, and you can see that this is pretty consistent with their national results as well. Pinterest tends to pull a somewhat older demographic than Instagram. So again, not huge surprise, but interesting to see that that's coming through at work in the nonprofit world. All right, let's look at communications frequency. This is probably the biggest "am I normal" question that I get. How often should we be sending this thing out? What is everybody else doing? What's normal? So this is probably the data that I end up repeating most often throughout the course of the year from the Trends Report. We used to just ask email frequency versus direct mail frequency. And we decided after getting some feedback on previous years that we really needed to split that out. So this year we asked it in 4 questions. We asked about email appeals versus email newsletters, and direct mail appeals versus direct mail newsletters. So on the appeals question, which we did define as either fundraising, advocacy, or a direct call to action, we found that 1/3 of nonprofits are sending these appeals at least monthly. So the blue is 20%, that's monthly. Every other week is the green piece there. The turquoise blue is weekly. And then the purple that's kind of between the red and the orange is several times a week. So that totals up to about 1/3. When we look at email newsletters now, which we're defining as more of an informational update, 59% send email newsletters at least monthly. So again, that's going to include monthly, every other week, weekly, several times a week. Last year when we combined these two, what we said is people or nonprofits email, 75% email at least monthly, because that was combining the newsletter and direct appeal. We don't really have that same stat this year, but I think those pretty much add up to the same frequency, I would bet. So email at least monthly is what the overwhelming majority of nonprofits are doing. Direct mail appeals. Again, same thing, fundraising or other direct call to action. Twice a year is the most common answer here. Okay, so that's going to be the orange slice at the bottom. The light blue up in the middle is quarterly. The 19.9% purple is once a year. So we see much less frequency with direct mail appeals compared to email, not surprising. Direct mail newsletters, quarterly is the most popular. And actually when you look at any single answer, not doing one is the most popular response. 31% said that they are not going to send any direct mail newsletters in 2014. Of those who are going to send, quarterly is going to be the most frequent answer, followed by twice a year. All right, let's shift into workload. What are you going to spend the most time producing in 2014? Email newsletter articles first, followed by Facebook updates, event marketing, email fundraising or advocacy, website articles, etc. There wasn't that much movement on this one compared to last year. I need to go dig into it a little bit more, but this is basically what we saw last year too. When we asked people what their biggest challenges were, lack of time to produce quality content, lack of budget for direct expenses, and lack of clear strategy were the top 3, followed by inability to measure effectiveness in producing engaging content. These were fairly consistent with last year as well. There may be this sort of, a nice straight angle there. I think it may have been a little sharper last year. I have to really dig into the comparisons, but the order is the same. Again, potential source of conflict here, just in terms of what you think might be holding you back. We did see very different answers this time. It wasn't the fundraising versus communicator split, however, it was more of that sort of management versus staff level split. So development directors and managers and communications directors and managers picked lack of time as their number one challenge. Executive directors picked lack of budget as their number one challenge. And then both development and communications coordinators or assistants picked lack of clear strategy as their number one, which I find very interesting because I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. And I wonder if that means that sort of the junior staff level is not being educated by the senior staff about the real strategy behind what they're being asked to do. Maybe they're asked to put together an email or to do Facebook without really being given the strategy. I don't know. That's just a hypothesis on my part, but I found this sort of interesting. Okay, we have another new question. This one is, which best describes how you feel about your current workload? There was a report that came out either last year or the year before about development professionals in particular and how overworked they feel. And so I thought, let's go ahead and ask this in the trends report and see what we get. So you had three choices. You're overworked. I'm asked to do more than I can in the time allotted. It's about right. My work matches well the time allotted to do it. Or I feel like I'm underworked. I could do more than I'm being asked to do in the time allotted. So pop quiz time again. Would you expect the overworked, underworked, just right results to vary by job title? Okay, so again, this is going to be executive director, development or communications manager, development or communications coordinator, those job titles that we've been looking at. What do you think? And again, same answers to choose from. I would expect it to vary significantly, not so much, or I'm not sure. Lindsay, got another question we can get to real quick?
Yes. What do you think about multiple administrators on a social media account? To keep messaging consistent, perhaps there should be one main administrator.
It's generally a good idea, at least in name, to have multiple administrators just because, you never know when someone's going to get hit by the proverbial bus or whatever it is. So you want someone to have access to the account because getting Facebook or Twitter to give it to you after the fact is never easy. So you need multiple people, at least in name, as administrators. It can be helpful, again, if you're feeling overworked, to spread that duty around. And there may be people within your organization that have really good content, really good things to say. And so empowering them to be at least a part of that voice can really work. Now, some people are concerned about the consistency issues. And I think that's just where you have to have really good internal communication about what's good and what's not. Other times they decide, you know what, we have 3 people that are going to post to Facebook. They all have a slightly different take or style or topic area. And so people will sign their status updates or sign their tweets with their initials, and that's one way to handle it. Okay, we have our results. This is interesting. More equally split this time. 48% expect variation, 48 don't, and then just a couple of you are not sure. So in every job title, the majority said they were overworked. Not surprising. It's sort of a 2/3 to 1/3. And then, there's always a couple of people that feel underworked. But overwhelmingly, most people feel overworked, and then there's a third that feel like it's about right. When we look at who this is most acute for, you see it's the managers, so the executive directors, and then the communications and marketing directors in particular are actually feeling more overworked than development directors. So again, I found that interesting because there'd already been some reporting and research done on development professionals. So now we have some numbers that add these two in the mix as well. All right, I'm going to ask the same question, but let's do the age split this time. So would you expect the overworked, underworked, just right results to vary by age? Yes, or no, or I'm not sure. Got another question for me, Lindsay?
Yes. Just going through, there's a lot of good ones here. Do email and mail frequencies change significantly by the size of the organization?
I haven't looked at this year's data that way, but we do look at that each year, and the answer is not really. There's some slight I'm just going to assume that 2014 says the same thing that 2013 and 2012 did, which is that there's not a lot of variation. Again, there's a little bit here and there, but from kind of a big picture perspective, there's not much.
Got it. I'm going to ask one more quick one. Would Twitter, on the time question that you had, Twitter seemed to be very low, and this person's wondering, is it because it's just a 140-character platform?
I don't know the whys. So we do have a number of different places where people could type in answers, and with over 2,000 responses, we're still reading those. But, I would guess that in part it's because it's a more limited place to put words. But, writing short can also be harder than writing long. I also just think it's, Twitter has not been as fully adopted as a platform as some of the others, like Facebook and email. So I think that's part of the answer, too.
That's great. Thanks. I see the poll's ended, so I think we'll have something in a second.
It seems like forever, but it's really not.
Whenever I wait for it. Well, and I know the second I ask you a question, it's going to pop up. So here we go.
Exactly. And here it is. Okay. So we had 36% expecting a difference, 58% not, and 5% not sure. Okay. So in every age group, a majority said that they were overworked. So there wasn't any huge differences there. But again, in terms of who's feeling it most acutely, people in their 30s were much more likely to say that they're overworked. And again, when you compare this to broader workplace research, it's very common for people in their 30s to express more stress than some of their younger, older colleagues. And that's often attributed to the fact that they're usually raising little kids while they're working. So again, that's not my conclusion. That's what I've read in other research. But I have no reason to believe that that would be the wrong answer for what's happening with this. But again, I don't know that because I didn't ask them why they were answering the question that way necessarily. We will go through and read a bunch of the comments and see if we can pull anything out. But that would be my educated guess for why people in their 30s were the group that felt most strongly about this. Okay, so that's all I've got to share with you right now. There's a lot more information I'm going to be going through. I'm going to be deep in SurveyMonkey for the next several weeks. All of this will be cleaned up and beautiful. We have professional graphic designers to help us. And then there's going to be additional analysis, much like we did last year. So we'll break this out by budget size. We have 5 or 6 different categories of budget. We also do the under and over $1 million, so we'll pull all the data that way. We also ask people to identify which state they're in, for those of you that answered that you were in the U.S. And so we break that out by the 4 major census regions. And I do that more for fun than anything else. It's sort of fun to see, which part of the country is most into Twitter or Instagram. And so we'll publish some of that information as well. We also run it by mission statement. Again, we use those dozen categories. And then I personally like to look at the difference between fundraisers and communications directors, because again, that's where I, in my practice as a coach and trainer, end up seeing a lot of conflict within nonprofits is when people have misunderstandings about goals or competing goals within the organization. We're also going to share some data on who reports to whom. This was another question that was suggested. People want to know, should the communications director report to the ED or to the fundraiser? Who does the fundraiser report to? So we asked that question, and we'll have the results in the final report. Again, it goes back to that, am I normal? Is our organization normal question? And then we had open-ended questions on what is your number 1 priority. We asked people to type it in their own words, and then also in their own words what they're excited about for 2014 and what's scaring them about 2014. So we have a lot of analysis to go through, but that will be included in the final report, and we'll be releasing that on January 7th. So all of you will get it. If you've signed up at my website, you'll get it directly from me. GuideStar is also going to send it out to everyone, so you may, in fact, get it a couple of times. But look for that for a lot more data. All right. I told you I was going to ask you what was most interesting or surprising to you. So I would love if you would just chat that in right now, wherever you're sending questions. Just go ahead and use that same interface. And then, Lindsay, if you can just sort of read off some of those. We're not going to be able to do everybody since we have about 500 people with us. But if you could just sort of eyeball it and see what people are saying is most interesting to them.
Absolutely. And while people are doing that, do you want to get cranking on a few questions?
Sure. Happy to do that too.
Okay, so first question. When you mentioned about communication coordinator or department, I wonder if there's any significant difference between external communications and internal communications work. In this person's organization, they have two different departments.
We did not ask that question. So I don't know. I would just sort of be guessing from my anecdotal experience.
Okay, great. And this, I'm starting to get some. So one says, no one seems to be using traditional mail anymore. The frequency and amount of newsletters and email asks is surprising. That 31% will not send out a direct mail newsletter at all in 2014, so a lot of people are surprised about the direct mail.
Let me just say something about that. The direct mail, and again, I have to really go in and parse the data pretty hard, but just based on what we saw last year, direct mail has a very clear link to fundraising goals. So if you're trying to fundraise from individuals, you are going to be much more inclined to use direct mail. And not all nonprofits are. A lot of nonprofits have funding from other sources, a wide variety of sources, and their individual donors are a pretty minimal contributor to their overall budget. And so those organizations often don't use direct mail. We also see newer organizations not really jumping into direct mail. So again, I'll pull the data and see what it says for this year, but based on the past, that's some of what's going on there.
A few people are very interested in the Instagram exploration that's going to happen. Some are finding that quite surprising as well. And a few are saying it's surprising that the younger workers are not the largest group of the overworked workers.
I didn't pull it last night, but when I looked at this a couple of weeks ago when the survey was still open, and I was like, who are these underworked people? In the nonprofit world, really anybody is answering this. So I looked, and it was most of those people at the time were younger. And so, again, I don't know what's going on there. It would just be a guess. Maybe they feel like they can do more than they're being assigned. Maybe they feel like they're not trusted with responsibility. I have no idea. But, and again, I'm not even sure what the final data was. But when I pulled it sort of midway, it was primarily younger people saying they were underworked.
Maybe that's just a happy finding for that group. That's great. So it looks like they're centering around most of the people's biggest surprises are centering on those three themes: the Instagram kind of exploration, the fact that there's the age gap in terms of being overworked, and the fact that there's a lack of direct mail that's going to happen next year.
Okay.
Do you want to get
good? Thank you.
Talking about some questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to take questions for the rest of the time.
Okay, great. We have a ton of them. So again, if we don't get to them all, we'll get to them later, hopefully. But one says, do you have any data on the size of marketing communications departments for nonprofits?
No. Again, that was it was so hard because I wanted to include so many more questions like the budget size for that office. I wanted to include years of experience in the field, which I think in some ways might actually be more helpful than the age question. But we added probably 10 additional questions this year over last year, and our completion rate went down. So, it's one of those things where you really have to kind of pick and choose because otherwise you end up with 100 questions and no one does the thing. So it's a great question, and we do additional surveys throughout the year. So I may hit all of these people that took this one with a follow-up survey in a couple months, and we could add a question like that. I'm going to jot a note down on that one.
And, GuideStar, we're a bunch of data nerds over here, so we completely feel your pain. You can't get them all, but you try to do as many as you can. And your survey was was quite expansive, so completely understand that. Here's a question. Do you restrict your post to your agency's concerns or your organization's concerns, or can you inject a random post from time to time of something that has caught a staff person's attention, a beautiful photo, a quote, or something about the larger community that they live in?
I think it's nice. I assume this is a social media question.
Yeah.
Lindsay, is that what it sounds like to you? Okay.
Yeah.
So what I would say is I think it's nice to mix it up a little bit. If it sounds too too PR-ish, too formulaic, too polished, people ignore it. That's not what they're on social media for. They're there for the more personal, authentic voice. And so I like mixing it up like that.
Great. Here's a really good question, and I don't know how you could possibly answer this, but how do you get everyone in your organization? And it's nothing against you. It's just a question to end all questions. How do you get everyone in your organization to agree on a communications strategy?
Okay, so the first thing I would do, and, this actually is a very real question I get all the time, right, because I'm coaching communications directors on how to get stuff done, and I get this pushback all the time. And so the first thing you have to do, what I recommend do, is starting with this fundraising versus community building goal conversation, because so much of the conflict flows from that. And are we talking about annual fundraising? Is that the measure by which we're going to decide whether this is a good or bad thing? Or are we taking more of a long view to fundraising, where if we believe that we do good community engagement in the short term, that in the long term that will have fundraising benefits? So start with that question. It's often not articulated within an organization, and forcing people to articulate the answer can be very helpful in moving those kind of conversations along. So I would start there. You can use the trends report to say, you know what, this is normal. This is what most people are doing. How are we different? Because of every nonprofit thinks they're special and different. So take the averages from the report that say people are doing this often, or this is the biggest challenge for them. How do we feel about that? And use it to start those conversations.
Great. How can we determine if Twitter or LinkedIn are well used in our mid-sized community or in general?
You can snoop around and see who's using it. There are different ways to search within both of those platforms that can give you have to go to the advanced search, but it allows you to do a little bit of digging just to see what kind of results you get. On Facebook, what I recommend people do is pretend like they're going to do an ad buy. That allows you to do a bunch of searching. You don't have to actually press the final button that purchases the ad, but you sort of fake it, pretend like you're creating an ad for Facebook, and it lets you do a lot of that kind of searching, and it'll tell you how many people meet these different criteria that you've selected. So that's another way to kind of gauge what's happening.
That's great. What's the ideal length of time for an effective video? What's the latest thinking on that?
I'm always in the 2 to 3 minute camp. I think it's got to be really, really awesome to get people to stay on longer than 3 minutes. There certainly are some that are longer, but they're usually really, really good.
Excellent.
So I would start with 2 to 3 minutes. 2 is usually plenty.
That's great. Do you feel that marketing development should be managed by the same person for a better coordination of organizational priorities?
Typically, yes. Now, again, there's going to be a million different caveats where I give a different answer, but overall, there needs to be a lot more coordination, very tight coordination between the communications marketing staff and the development staff. So if those people are managed by different people, there needs to be really tight, good, ongoing intercommunication between those two offices. Otherwise, you end up with goals that are not complementary, and you end up with people communicating confusing messages out to the world because they're saying different things at different times.
Mm-hmm. Great. What's the importance of a mobile-ready website? Mobile has been such a topic this year, and I assume it will be next year too. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's another one that we sort of left off that we could have asked a lot of questions on. So it's very important, and if you go into your Google Analytics and if you have a good email newsletter provider, they will give you the data for how many people are looking at your email on a phone or going to your website on a phone or other mobile device, and those numbers are continuing to climb. I can't remember the exact stat now, but it's in the not too distant future, as in the next year or two or three, the majority of email will be read on a mobile device. So yeah, it's really important that you optimize for those itty-bitty little screens.
Mm-hmm. And so this is a good point. A good question. What type of metrics are best for nonprofit reporting and communications?
You have to go back to your goals. So figure out the 2 or 3 or 4 indicators of success based on your goals. So if it's a fundraising goal, obviously it's going to be more fundraising related, but it may not be just pure dollars. You may be looking at your donor retention rate, or you may be looking at the number of new donors that you're bringing in regardless of their gift size. So there are a bunch of different numbers that you can track. If you're not looking at fundraising in particular, you're probably going to want to look at a series of numbers. How big is the list overall, whether it's your Facebook fans or your email list? How active are people on that list? So what's that engagement level? Again, you may, as you get more sophisticated, be able to break that down by types of people. So you may be interested in recruiting people of a certain age or people who live in a certain neighborhood, and you'll be able to kind of track that data as well.
Great. So one person asked, what do you think the biggest focal point will be for communicators next year?
You know, I still always think it's, and I've said this for the last couple of years, but it's finding a way to focus and do something well. There are so many different communications channels. Most of you are trying to talk about way too many things to people. It's not your fault. Your organizations are doing lots of cool stuff. But the inability to really narrow down what you're going to talk about and where you're going to talk about it so that you can do an incredible job with that is a real challenge. We just see a lot of people doing their best and doing really mediocre work because they're all overworked and stressed out and trying to do too much at once. It's not their fault. It's not that they're bad at it. They're just trying to do too much at once. So focus, prioritize. That's the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Great points. There's a question about acquisition tactics. What are nonprofits trying to do and what's working well? Are they trying to acquire donors, volunteers, clients, people that come to the events, et cetera? Do you have thoughts on that?
You know, it's all of the above, and I think, you know, the answer, unfortunately, is you have to try lots of things, and that leads into everybody being overworked, right, and being too scattered. But I don't think there is ever going to be a one-size-fits-all solution anymore. You know, a lot of people want to drop print. You know, that's very clear from the survey results. And if you're trying to reach the older boomers and older, you've got to leave some print in the mix. You know, that's just what the trends tell us. And if you're trying to reach the younger boomers and younger, you really got to get your act together online. So, and if you're trying to reach everybody, then you have to do both. And that's where most nonprofits are. And so they really do have to do both. Mm-hmm. And I think that applies to acquisition and retention and everything. It's always going to be a multi-channel integrated approach now. There are very few things where you can do it in one communication channel and really succeed.
Mm-hmm. Great. One person said that they're surprised that people are relying so heavily on Facebook. Do you have thoughts on why that is?
You know, I think it's just always been the biggest player out there. So, you know, in terms of the social media choices, I just think they're the big dog. And, you know, everybody's going to go there first in terms of social media. Now, when you compare Facebook to other communications channels, I do worry sometimes about the investment in Facebook because Facebook changes the rules all the time and is not particularly friendly to nonprofits, frankly, in my opinion. So, I do have some concerns about that. They don't rise to the level of telling you not to do Facebook. I would never say that. I think you have to be on Facebook. But, I would personally rather see you figure out email marketing and really understand that and understand how to build your list and how to segment your list and really optimize your use of email as opposed to spending tons and tons of time on Facebook.
Great. So somebody had a question. You've mentioned a few times getting really focused and narrowing down your focus. And how does that contrast with diversifying the communication channels? How do you balance diversifying and focusing at the same time?
It's really hard. It's really hard, and I know it sounds like I'm saying, talking out of both sides of my mouth, but it's the reality. And I wish that all of you had the investment in staff and resources to hire more people to help you get the job done. But that's just not the reality for most of you. So, I am encouraging people to do what I call the focus and flounder model, which is if you can't drop anything, then take it step by step, focus on one thing at a time, and let the rest flounder while you're focusing. So maybe you say, January and February, I'm going to nail Facebook. I'm going to figure it out. And you know what? You just kind of phone the rest in. You don't you don't worry so much about it, and then you get Facebook right, and then you pick up email in March and April. You get your email newsletter worked out. Over time, you're going to have increased your effectiveness in all those channels, but that takes the realization that you're going to let some things slide. But you know what? You're letting things slide now. If you're trying to do all of it and not doing a very good job, you're letting stuff slide too. So, it's just about being honest with yourself and realistic about what you can get done with the resources you have.
That's great, and this is a good segue question. Someone said, if we don't know our audiences on Instagram exactly, but we know that that's a really big channel coming up, should we just try out the channel to make sure that we have a presence on there?
Absolutely, and I think you can do it in a kind of lightweight sort of way. Just get on there with something that seems to make sense. It shouldn't be completely in left field, but it shouldn't be something that you invest tons and tons of brain power into either. And just see what happens. Do something that just sort of feels right and play around with it a little bit.
Great. So I think we have time for maybe two more questions.
Okay.
And again, we're not going to be able to get to everything, so hopefully we'll get additional answers next year. But how do you find relevant images for Instagram and Pinterest? We're getting a lot of Instagram questions, I think, because of this.
Well, they're two different things. So in Instagram, you're really uploading your own content. So you're taking the picture yourself. And, it's just sort of opening your mind and your eyes to what things you could photograph that would work for your cause or for your staff, for your target audience, however you want to think about it. With Pinterest, it is very much more of a curation sort of activity. So yes, you're going to pin your own stuff up there, but you're also going to be looking for things from other places. And with Pinterest, I would just start on Pinterest. Just search for things, maybe you're into owls. I'm looking at a picture of an owl on my office door. So you're into owls. Go on to Pinterest and, see who else is into saving the owls and start pinning some of that stuff and then add your own content.
Great. Okay, last one, I think. Do you think there's a significant difference between an email thank you and a snail mail thank you?
Let me answer the question this way. So you always want to thank first in the channel through which the gift was received. So if it's an online gift, you send an email thank you first. If it's a direct mail gift, you send a piece of paper first. After that, it's in your best interest to try to communicate cross-channel. So it's okay to send email thank yous to the direct mail people. That's what you want to do. That's a good thing. And vice versa. It's good to send your online people some direct mail every now and then. There have been a couple of different studies that have shown that that kind of cross-pollination of your lists can produce better results in the long term. So, I think the channel where the gift is coming really dictates the channel that you should use for the thank you.
Super helpful. Are there any other final comments you have before we wrap this up?
No, just everyone sort of wished me luck as I dive into SurveyMonkey, because I may never come out again. There are so many different ways you can run these reports. So that's what I'm going to be doing over the next couple of weeks, and we'll make ourselves stop at some point and turn it over to our design team to get that report done and out the door on the 7th.
I think I speak for everyone. We do wish you luck. We're so excited you were with us. Thank you. And for everybody on the phone, thanks for taking the time to be with us. We have a bunch of webinars coming up, so if you go to GuideStar.org/webinars, you can find those. And again, you'll get this presentation